Good evening. Welcome to Views from the U, the political science of election 2022. My name is Andy Karch, and I'm the chair of the political science department here at the University of Minnesota. And whether you're with us here in the McNamara Alumni Center or live streaming the event, we are delighted that you've decided to join us, and we are looking forward to a great discussion tonight. So we've got less than 2 weeks to go until Election Day, and early voting's already underway in many places. And so with that as our backdrop, tonight we'll have 5 faculty experts who are going to take us behind the headlines and tell us what they're tracking and what we should be keeping in mind as the midterm campaign comes down the stretch. Let me say a quick word about each of our presenters and work our way down the row. So our first presentation will be given by Professor Michael Minta. He's an expert in congressional politics, interest groups, and race and ethnic politics, and his presentation is entitled Changing Demographics and the 2022 Midterm Elections. Following that, our second presentation will be given by Professor Kathryn Pearson, who's an expert on the U.S. Congress, congressional elections, and women in politics. And her presentation is entitled Partisan Tides and the 2022 Midterm Elections in Minnesota. Our third presentation will be given by Professor Dan Myers, whose research lies at the intersection of political psychology and political communication, with a special focus on group-based polarization. And his presentation is entitled Election Fundamentals and Minnesota's Shifting Party Coalitions. Our fourth presentation will be given by Professor Tim Johnson, who's an expert on judicial politics, Supreme Court oral arguments, Supreme Court decision-making, and really all things Supreme Court. And his presentation is appropriately titled The Supreme Court and the Midterm. And Professor David Samuels will give our final presentation, an expert on Brazilian and Latin American politics. He has co-authored an award-winning book called Inequality and Democratization, and that's the subject of his presentation, The Future of Democracy in International Perspective. So each of our presenters will speak for 10 minutes, and I'll sit in the front row and flag them down when they have 2 minutes left. Once the presentations are complete, we'll turn things over to John Coleman, the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and himself a political scientist by training, to moderate a Q&A discussion during which our panelists will respond to questions from the audience. So when you entered the hall, you noticed as you sat down some index cards, and so if a question comes to mind, please complete that index card, fill it out, and pass it down to the aisle where the amazing staff of the political science department will collect it and pass it along to the dean. They'll be coming through the aisles after the second, fourth, and fifth presentations, those by Professors Pearson, Johnson, and Samuels. Rest assured, we'll make sure that your questions find their way to the dean. So those are the ground rules, and with those ground rules established, it gives me great pleasure now to turn over the podium to my distinguished colleagues, and so we'll begin with Professor Michael Minta. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Andy, Dean Coleman. Thanks, everyone, for taking your valuable time to come here and listen to us say a few words about this election. I was just telling my colleagues, like, if you're a Democrat, you're probably dreading this election. If you're a Republican, you're too ecstatic and you're just so happy. But again, that's why we're here, and that's what we love about our election season, because elections have real consequences. I'm going to talk about changing demographics and what it can mean for the future of elections. Got way too many slides, but I'll try to go through these pretty quickly. Looking at how demographics play a role in U.S. electoral contests. We keep hearing demographics are destiny. Well, possibly. We'll explore that. We'll see if this means the changing racial and ethnic demographics of our country. What does it mean for Democrats or Republicans? Is one party advantaged over the other? We'll look at, does it lead to the election of racial and ethnic minorities? Probably won't spend as much time on that in the interest of time. And then we'll look at some of the challenges of a changing country demographically in terms of a diverse electorate, in terms of white backlash, in terms of political polarization, because some of those there's some links to that. Okay, hold on, there we go. So we can see if we look at this slide, and the Pew Research Center has done a lot of work on this, and you can see when you look at the overall growth in the electorate, the vote eligible electorate, you can see that non-whites are growing at a faster rate. Latinos growing at a much faster rate than any other demographic group. 39% increase from 2000 to the 2018 election. Blacks followed with 17%. But when you take Asian Americans, blacks, and Hispanics, you can see that the net non-white growth from 2000 to 2018 is 76%. So the growth is real. But what does this mean for Democrats and Republicans? Is there an opportunity for either of these groups to take advantage of this? And do you see an advantage of one party or the other? So if we look at some of the registration, these are registered voters and by race and ethnic background. And you can see that in terms, with many of these groups, that blacks are more likely or associated with voting for Democrats, along with Latinos and Asian Americans, while most white voters are with Republicans. So it can have real consequences if they continue, if you have these racial and ethnic groups, blacks, Latinos, and Asian Americans are continuing this trend and being a bigger part of the electorate, it can have some, if they turn out to vote, it can have some consequences for seemingly the Democratic Party. And you can see some of this in terms of the battleground states, in terms of where the states where you see the highest growth, where the percentage of the white electorate is actually declining and the percentage of the black and Latino of the electorate are actually increasing. And so you can see key states like Florida, Arizona, and Pennsylvania. Less so in states like Wisconsin and Michigan. Black voter turnout and Latino voter turnout declined in 2016, but it rebounded in 2018, where you saw a higher percentage in the midterm election than before. So again, presidential years are usually lower, but midterms 2018, many people were energized by seemingly some of the policies of the Trump administration. Now, individual level factors can play a big role. So although we see this growth of the non-white population, but turnout really matters a lot. And so, but when you look at it in terms of the factors that predict voter turnout, people with higher education, people with higher income are more likely to turn out to vote. But when you look at groups like blacks and Latinos that usually have lower education and income relative to whites, it may not necessarily mean, even though you might see changes in terms of the demographics, it may not necessarily show up in the polls. Another stat that's not on here, with Asian Americans, even though their growth is higher and they have higher education and higher income, but in terms of voter turnout, they're one of the groups that turn out at the lowest rate. So again, these demographics changes may not necessarily map on to higher turnout. And here's a chart of just overall turnout. I'll skip that. We'll go through these. And then a chart that's too small for you to see. Sorry. But this is supposed to show the proportion of states where you see the largest number of blacks in the electorate. And so you can see mostly southern states, but in terms of states that have been kind of battleground states like Georgia, Virginia, where blacks comprise a big part of the vote eligible population. Same thing, Asian Americans, you can see in California, Hawaii, Alaska, the growth here, and then also with Latinos, mostly in the southwestern states, and many of these states are battleground states like Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, and Florida. So you can see that the growth in these key states can have consequences in terms of elections for Democrats and Republicans. Let me skip through this. And we can also see as the demographics change, the voting rights, it also has had implications in terms of how Congress looks and how the federal legislature looks, where you see, particularly in the House of Representatives, where more blacks and Latinos are actually being elected to serve for office. You can see that in, again, just a snapshot here in terms of the proportion of minorities in the United States that we're approaching some parity in terms of descriptive representation, where you're seeing blacks approximating the proportion of legislators in the House of Representatives, Latinos still underrepresented, but still it's growing, and then obviously in the Senate, if you believe in that the legislature should look more like the rest of the nation, and well, the Senate has some challenges, and you can't draw minority districts. It's only for the House. At the same time, as you're seeing this growth in terms of the non-white population, in the electorate, and you're seeing more blacks and Latinos being elected to United States Congress, going along with that, sorry, 2 minutes, okay, sorry. Thought I had it on vibrate, sorry. Party polarization is also increasing, so as the racial and ethnic diversity has come in, you're also seeing more polarization between the two parties, and it's in the House and it's in the Senate. This can have impacts in terms of getting legislation done. You're seeing more filibusters in the Senate, you're seeing more holds, so it's very difficult in the Senate to get the work of Congress done. Major legislation is getting more difficult to pass. What is this polarization as it's going along with the racial and ethnic diversity? What does it mean for the passage of major policies such as health care, immigration reform, the environment, taxes? And let me skip to my conclusion. Black and Latinos play a significant role in determining who will win the U.S. presidency and the control of the United States Congress. That's becoming very clear. But voter turnout is key. That's why you're going to start seeing these different results in terms of the midterms and the presidential years. Diversity of the electorate has made Congress more racially and ethnically diverse. And then let me skip through this. But there are challenges to changing demographics. There's enactment of more restrictive voting measures that may limit minority participation in elections, white backlash, the rise of the Tea Party, and the rise of white reactionary groups, and of course, Donald Trump himself. So anyway, thank you, Kathryn.
Great. Thank you, Michael, and thank you all for being here. It's great to be with you to talk about partisan tides in the 2022 midterm elections in Minnesota. As Michael has shown, the U.S. is polarized, deeply and narrowly divided along partisan lines. And although Minnesota has consistently voted Democratic in presidential elections, Minnesota is narrowly divided as well. The Minnesota State Senate is controlled by Republicans with a 1-seat edge, and the Minnesota State House is controlled by Democrats with a 4-seat edge. And so it's very close. 4 of our congressional districts are held by Democrats, 4 are held by Republicans. And so it's no surprise that Minnesota is home this cycle to several competitive elections, both statewide and in some key swing districts. And so I'll dive deeper into those elections tonight. But first I want to provide some context about midterm elections. Midterm elections differ from presidential election years in some really important ways. The president's party typically loses votes and seats. This was the case in 2018. It was a referendum on President Trump. A record number of voters, over 2/3, said that they were voting for or against President Trump when they went to the polls in 2018, and he wasn't on the ballot. But nonetheless, it was a referendum, and Democrats won big. 2022 will be a referendum on President Biden. We're certainly seeing that in all of the ads. Democrats, for their part, hope to make it a referendum on former President Trump as well. So we do hear a lot about former President Trump from Democrats, but I think we'll really know sort of what President Trump's future looks like after the 2020 results are out. Midterm election turnout is 20 points on average lower than in presidential election years. And that has critically important implications for the parties. They really try to mobilize their base rather than persuade the independent voters who are just less likely to turn out in midterm elections. But the drop-off in turnout is not random. It's more likely to occur with young people and with people for who have more barriers and costs to getting to the polls. The economy is always an issue in elections, but it's a particularly big issue in 2022, with inflation and the economy consistently polling on the top of voters' minds. But because of the Dobbs decision in June, abortion is also an important election issue as well. In the U.S. House of Representatives, of course, elections occur every 2 years. And in midterm elections, it's a referendum on the party in power. And over the past century, the president's party has lost seats in almost every election. On average, 32 seats per midterm election, the only exceptions being 1934, 1998, and 2002. And the reason those cycles are exceptions is because the incumbent president was unusually popular. And that's certainly not the case in 2022, as President Biden's approval ratings are hovering in the low 40s. So in 2022, in the House, Republicans only need 5 seats to take majority party control. If you look at the competitive seats, and because of redistricting, this is actually an unusually large number of competitive seats. Most House races just aren't competitive at all. Democrats are defending 59 competitive seats. Those include seats that analysts rank as either toss-ups or leans toward, or lean or are likely Democratic seats. But Republicans are only defending 26 competitive seats. So you can see the advantage that Republicans have in this year that heavily favors Republicans. Over time, there have been many fewer swing districts. And in 2020, after the elections were over, we found that only 16 congressional districts out of 435 split their votes. In other words, they voted for one party's candidate for the House, and they voted for the other party's candidate for the White House. That's an unusually low number. During the 1970s, 1980s, those numbers were well over the 100s. And so we can see a changing environment in terms of party loyalty and voting, where voters are less likely to split their tickets. Redistricting effects also give Republicans an edge in 2022. The edge is not as large as it was in 2020, but nonetheless, Republicans still have an edge because there are more states with unified party control held by Republicans than there are Democratic seats. This graphic from 538 shows that shows the midterm seat shift, and you can see that 2002 outlier there, where Republicans actually picked up vote share from the previous election. But in general, the party in the White House loses seats, or as this figure shows, a chunk of the vote share from the preceding presidential election. The only question is how much? How big will that partisan tide be? And the factors that determine the partisan tide, or its size, are, again, the approval of the incumbent president and the state of the economy. So what does that mean for House races in Minnesota? Well, in general, most Minnesota House districts are not that competitive anymore because they are drawn in such a way by an independent judicial panel, I might add, that they're not that competitive. Really, only Minnesota's 2nd district is competitive. And that race features incumbent Congresswoman Angie Craig, who was first elected in 2018, was re-elected in 2020. She first ran in 2016 against Jason Lewis, who defeated her. She went on to defeat him in 2018. In 2020, she defeated Tyler Kistner, and Tyler Kistner is running again in 2022. And so in such a swing district where the party identifiers are nearly evenly divided, it's a very competitive seat. Most of the analysts rank it as a toss-up. It started out as sort of lean Democratic, and actually one of the analysts just switched it the other day to lean Republican. So I think that just really shows us what a competitive race it is. And it's not because as an incumbent Craig has made any missteps. Her legislative effectiveness score is very high. She's introduced a lot of bills. She has tried to work across party lines in an increasingly polarized Congress, as Michael has talked about. But the dynamics of a swing district in a partisan year give an edge to the candidate whose party is not sitting in the White House. If you look at fundraising in that race, Craig's campaign has raised $6.8 million, which is considerably more than Kistner's $2.8 million. But there are plenty of ads on both sides because independent groups have swooped in. They can't coordinate with the candidates, but they have spent $5.6 million to help Angie Craig and over $6 million to help Tyler Kistner. So if you're watching any of those ads in the 2nd Congressional District, most of them are negative and most of them are funded by outside groups. And that dynamic is repeated in all of the competitive districts across the country. Minnesota's 1st district features a somewhat competitive race against sort of recently elected incumbent Brad Finstead and Hormel exec Jeff Ettinger, but this is a district that Donald Trump won by 10 points in 2020, and so although the candidates have raised a lot of money, actually Ettinger has raised quite a bit more, this is not a race where outside groups have gotten involved because it isn't seen as being that competitive. Turning quickly away from Minnesota, looking at the U.S. Senate, over the last century, the out party, or the party not in the White House, has gained Senate seats in 18 of 25 midterms. So not quite as consistent of a record is in the House. And this is a situation where party control in the next Congress is a toss-up, and candidate quality also matters. Each party is defending 5 competitive seats, but there are some surprisingly competitive races, particularly in Ohio and in Pennsylvania. Turning now to Minnesota. In 2020, Biden defeated Trump by about 7 points, much bigger than the 1.5 points that Trump lost to Hillary Clinton in 2016. So again, Minnesota is a state that usually goes Democratic in presidential elections, but because it's such a good year for Republicans in general, incumbent statewide Democrats are all in jeopardy of losing their seats. Recent polls suggest that several of the races are within the margin of error. This figure from NPR News, created by David Montgomery, shows the electoral margins in Minnesota from 2002 to 2020. And it shows a lot of things, but I want to really emphasize just how much greater Minnesota and Hennepin County have diverged over the past 20 years. Looking at the DFL margins in Hennepin County, over 300,000 in 2020 compared to greater Minnesota, almost over $200,000. And as you can see, way back in 2002, Hennepin County and greater Minnesota voted much more similarly. So the bases of vote share in Minnesota have really, really diverged. Biden's victory in 2020 shows just how important Hennepin and Ramsey counties are to DFL candidates. And that's something to keep in mind as you think about statewide races in Minnesota in 2022 and sort of where the competitive races are and where people are most likely to turn out. So what this really shows is that to win statewide, DFL candidates need big margins in the metro, and the metro is not where the competitive congressional and state legislative races are. So Governor Tim Walz, of course, is defending his governor's mansion versus former state senator Scott Jensen. And these two candidates are quite distinct from one another, but are polling very close just because of that close divide within Minnesota. Looking at legislative races, very, very close. Out of 201 total seats for the state House and state Senate, there are only about 24 competitive races. St. Cloud area, exurbs and suburbs, and also on the Iron Range, where the DFL is fighting to keep its few remaining seats in Greater Minnesota. I'm going to skip that slide and just sort of conclude by noting that 2022 will be a good year for Republicans nationally and in Minnesota. But the question is just how good. Both parties are on track to set midterm campaign spending records. In midterm House and Senate elections, over $9 billion has already been spent, which will be a new record. And of course, the outcomes will determine party control and policymaking in the next 2 years and set the stage in many ways for the 2024 elections. Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody for coming out. I'm Dan Myers, Assistant Professor of Political Science, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the broader factors that can help us understand the kind of trends that Professor Pearson was just talking about. I'm going to do so, I'm going to make a little bit of a counterintuitive argument here that even though it seems like we live in these times of great political change, in some ways our politics are more stable and unchanging than they've ever been before. And so the key to understanding this is what political scientists refer to as partisanship. And so partisanship doesn't just mean who you vote for. When we talk about partisanship, we're talking about a psychological attachment that people feel to any kind of social group, but in this case, to one of the two political parties. Most Americans, even if they don't want to admit it, feel some kind of a psychological attachment to either the Republican or the Democratic Party. And this is a social identification, much in the way that many of you probably identify as members of the University of Minnesota community. We've got some Vikings fans or some Packers fans. That is the kind of psychological tie we're talking about. What that means is that part of your own identity is tied up with the fate of the group, in this case, the political party. It doesn't necessarily mean that you always like that political party. So again, Vikings fans can probably sympathize with that. But it means that their losses and wins are in some way yours losses and wins. To understand the power of partisanship, I'm gonna show it. I'm gonna give an example that involves these two guys. So folks probably recognize, we've got Mitt Romney there and Donald Trump. And of course, Mitt Romney is the Republican nominee in 2012, Donald Trump in 2016. It is hard to imagine, hard to imagine two Republicans more distant from each other than these two men. Romney, of course, famously doesn't vote for Trump in 2016. He later reveals that he wrote in his wife's name. After the election, though, Romney comes to Trump and sort of tries to be an adult in the room. He sort of interviews to be Trump's Secretary of State, and Trump rejects him. That is this famous dinner right there. Romney, of course, then goes on to win a Senate seat from Utah and vote to throw Trump out of office after January 6th. Okay, so two Republicans, but probably the furthest apart two Republicans we can think of. Now, what I'd like you all to do is to fix a number in your mind, take a guess. What percent of people who pulled the lever for Mitt Romney in 2012 then went on to vote for Donald Trump in 2016? What percent of people voted for Mitt Romney, and then 4 years later, Donald Trump? Okay, everybody got a guess? All right, and the answer is almost all of them. So about 84% of 2012 Romney voters ended up voting for Donald Trump. Only 5% of folks who voted for Romney in 2012 switched over to Hillary Clinton. And that wasn't particularly unique, although, so 81% of 2012 Obama voters go on to vote for Clinton in 2016. And actually more Democrats defect from Clinton to Trump, about 9%, than the other way. Only about 5% of Romney voters switch over to Clinton. Between the 2016 and the 2020 election, we see even more stability. 94% of people who voted for Trump in 2016 stick with him in 2020. 95% of those who voted for Clinton in 2016 vote for Biden. So we can think of all of the things that happened in those 4 years. It seemed like, and I would say as a political scientist, it objectively was a pretty crazy time. but we see almost total stability in vote choice. And so this is partisanship. This is the power of partisanship, this psychological tie that people have to a party that affects all kinds of things about how people process information, the news sources people select, and ultimately, it has a pretty determinative effect on who people vote for. So if you want to know who people are going to vote for in 2014 or 2024 or even in 2022, you can just ask them who they voted for in 2012, and you'll have a pretty good guess. This isn't to say that the people who switch sides aren't important. So the fact that 9% of Obama voters switch over to Trump and only 5% of Romney voters switch to Clinton, that's probably what gives Trump his edge and allows him to win a narrow electoral college victory instead of the other way around. But it's notable how much stability there is at the individual level, even in times that we think are pretty crazy. Now, this individual stability also produces a lot of state-level stability. So this is a chart. On the bottom axis, you'll see Obama's percentage of the vote in each of the 50 states in DC in 2012, Clinton's on the y-axis there. And so states that are on that black line, those states gave the same percent of the vote to Obama in 2012 and Clinton in 2016. As we can see, most states are really close to that black line. There's a very high correlation there. Correlation between 2016 and 2020 is even tighter. Very little change at the state level, sort of minor fluctuations in the percentage of vote received by the two parties. Okay. So what does this mean for Minnesota? And so one effect of this incredibly strong partisanship that most people experience in our current political climate is that state-level elections, which used to be somewhat uncorrelated with national-level elections, have become more partisan and more nationalized. So this is a chart that shows the DFL share of the vote in state Senate districts in 2016, and then the percent of the vote that Hillary Clinton gets in the same state Senate district. Again, if you're on that line, that means the DFL candidate got the same percent of the vote in the state Senate election as Hillary Clinton did. And as we can see, most districts very close to that line, even more so in 2020. Extremely high correlation between how many votes does the DFL candidate get in the state Senate election and how many votes does Joe Biden get in the same area. All right. So we have this time of seeming immense political change, but also just an incredible amount of political stability. The political scientists John Sides and Liv Vavrick use the phrase calcified politics to describe this. We're sort of stuck in these combat lines. All right, so that's what stays the same. For the last couple minutes, though, I want to talk about what does change. And so if you've lived in Minnesota for long enough, you can look at these charts and see the high correlation, the very close relationship between state-level voting for the state Senate, and voting for the presidential level. But it still seems like something has changed in the last couple decades in Minnesota. And so when does that happen? So I like to talk about this in terms of what we think of parties both as a social identity, but also as a coalition of groups. Okay? So a party isn't the headquarters in DC, it's not the candidates running for office. It's a coalition of groups that people identify with that are also associated with one of the two major parties. I like to illustrate this with the Minnesota DFL because the coalition is right there in the name. Okay? So who's in this party? What are the social groups that make up this party? Well, Democrats, farmers, laborers. Okay? So that is the coalition, at least as enshrined in the DFL name. And up until really the 90s, you can still see this coalition geographically with a very strong. What we're looking at here is the results of state Senate elections. Again, I like that because it's a state-level office, but a relatively high state-level office. And so the bluer state districts, of course, get more Democratic votes, the redder districts more Republican votes. And so looking at 1992, you can see that coalition on the map, right? So we got some laborers up there in the Iron Range. We got the farmers up in Colin Peterson's old 8th district. And then in the urban core, you've got the Democrats, right? As time goes on in Minnesota, and I'm going to show you every state Senate election between now and then, we see that coalition slowly start to fall apart. The blues get lighter outstate, they get darker in-state, the red creeps from the suburbs out into the outstate. And then in 2016, we see a really, really momentous change, okay? So suddenly there's a lot of bright red where there were farmers. The blue laborers are sort of just barely holding on, but the Democrats are much stronger in the metro area. And then in 2020, we see a continuation of the same, although this is a little misleading because, of course, these two state senators leave the Democratic Party right after the 2020 election, Bach and Tomassoni. All right, so how can we make sense of this? How can we account for this? I'm going to use an example from my neighborhood. So I live in Minneapolis. I live in the 62nd State Senate District. That's that circle right there. So this is literally the most Democratic state Senate district in the state. It's not quite correct to say that all of my neighbors are Democrats, but it's not too far off either. And if you walk around my neighborhood, you see a lot of this sign or variations on this sign. So folks are probably familiar with this sign. People have seen this sign before. We used to have a guy around the corner who had this sign out in his yard, but he moved away a couple years ago. Okay. And if we think of the traditional DFL coalition, we can see why this would be uncomfortable, right? As urban liberals have become a more important part of the DFL coalition, and as environmental issues, particularly around the boundary waters, become more important to that constituent group of the coalition, there isn't space for both groups in the coalition. Someone's got to go. And as we've seen, it's the Iron Range laborers who have gradually left the Democratic Party. And indeed, if you look at what Tom Bach says when he leaves the Democratic Party, declares himself an independent, caucusing with Republicans, it's exactly that. Mining and resource-based economy that the Democrats no longer support, the DFL no longer supports. Okay, thank you.
Thank you all for being here tonight. Whenever the chair asks me to be a part of this event, I always sort of scratch my head because the general answer as to whether or not the Supreme Court has an effect on general election or presidential elections or off-year elections is generally there's no effect, right? Al Gore argued in 2000 that it was all about the court. Hillary Clinton made the argument a little bit. President Trump clearly made the argument pretty effectively in 2016, better than Hillary Clinton did. But generally, the court doesn't play a large role in elections, except insofar as it will set policy for elections. And that, I'll talk about that at the end of these 10 minutes. But what I want to talk about tonight are two specific questions, and that is what impact might the court have on the election this year? And again, the answer could be none, although I think there's probably a little bit. And then what might the court be doing after the election to have an effect on policy generally, but on future elections in the United States? And so to turn to the first question, Justice Alito was speaking today. He has been speaking a lot. There were articles in the press today talking about Justice Alito, and Justice Alito has suggested that there is a direct assault on the U.S. Supreme Court. And it's not the assault of people being unhappy with the policies or legal decisions that the justices hand down. You can be unhappy with Dobbs, you can be unhappy with the guns decision, you can be unhappy with freedom of religion decisions, but do not call the court's legitimacy into question. That is a direct assault, according to Justice Alito, and in fact, he went insofar as to say that he and his colleagues may be in danger of assassination attempts because they are considered an illegitimate institution now, at least by some part of the electorate. And it turns out that the first bullet point here, I wasn't going to talk about legitimacy. I was going to talk about one word, and that is abortion, 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 or reproductive rights, or more generally, the idea of women, which are more than 50% of the population in this nation, having autonomy over their own bodies. And that is the argument. I mean, there's a few other issues that people are concerned about with the court, but those issues generally don't come up in the list of the issues that people care about most when they're thinking about for whom to vote in either a midterm or a presidential election. But this year, reproductive rights is that issue that has finally gotten over that threshold of having some effect. And as an aside, that may very well be the reason why the Dobbs decision was leaked on May 1st of this year. And the hypothesis that I continue to say, although I won't say it publicly, and I'm not even saying it publicly here, that decision was leaked by none other than Justice Alito himself. And it may have been one of his clerks, but if it was one of his clerks, it was probably at his behest, because Americans have very short memories. And as my colleagues who are much more experts on elections than I am would tell you, that idea of having short memories means that if you drop an opinion, which has not been done in the history of the court in the way it was done in this way, on May 1st, you are more than 6 months away from the election. And if you drop that opinion on June 30th, you are much closer to the election by essentially 2 months, and maybe that memory and the push from the left and for reproductive rights and for women's rights will have an effect on the election. But the counter to that is, and I tried to think what the counter was, and it really comes back to James Carville. And that is, not to be politically incorrect, but James Carville was, and it's the economy, stupid. And that was the phrase of the Clinton campaign in 1992, and they said it again and again and again and again. And the pushback of the GOP this year in Minnesota and beyond is that this is not an election about abortion. And if you're watching TV, and many people, including political scientists, have a hard time watching TV these days, because of the political ads, the Republican Party is making the argument that this is not an election about abortion. It's an election about inflation and an election about the stock market tanking and the economy tanking. And so this is the battleground of issues. And if the court is going to have an effect on this election, it is going to be on turnout from the left, where the battle cry is those 3 words that I have up top. And the question empirically is, which is going to win? And the data are probably pretty clear. Now, initially, you would think that, and this comes from the New York Times in August, that you're going to get a pretty good bump from Dobbs. And this is a bump in that you see in terms of voter registration, and you see a massive jump in August. You see a jump in July. And you essentially see that there is this coalition of forces that say we are going to have another million-woman march, but it's not going to be to the mall in Washington, D.C. It's going to be to the voting booth from Maine to California. So initially, I think the argument bears some weight. But then you take a look at what happens next, and these are data from September. And you look at the most important issue. And inflation continues to beat abortion again and again and again. And while abortion is the second most important issue to most Americans, you then include health care, January 6th, immigration, guns, and crime. And if you add those together with it's the economy, stupid, in terms of inflation, it probably beats back the idea that abortion, specifically the court's Dobbs decision, will have an effect on this election. And then you finally can compare this to October 20th data from 538, and this is the smallest prediction that 538 has had for Democrats' ability to hold on to the Senate. I mean, there was one point, and Kathryn or Michael well, Kathryn or Michael can probably correct me. At one point, it was probably 79% probability that the Senate would be held by the Democrats. And now it's down to 61. And obviously, that's still much more than a majority, but it is the worst numbers that we have seen, and it's probably going to track lower and lower as we get toward Election Day. The point is this, and that is, I think we will go back to normal, and that is that the conventional wisdom being that the court will not have an effect, and that even though you're seeing this spike in Georgia, and you're seeing a spike in Pennsylvania in registrations, and in fact in early voting, it probably will not have the effect that the economy will have on people's decision on for whom they should vote. So the second question I want to ask, and I'll do this very quickly, is what about the court's impact after 2022? And I'm going to talk about 2 impacts in terms of elections and 2 in terms of other policies. And the first is the Voting Rights Act. And the court already gutted the Voting Rights Act in recent terms in several cases. And I don't think there's any going back because there's not a coalition in Congress to probably fix the Voting Rights Act. And this term in Merrill versus Milligan in Alabama, the court is taking another bite at the apple and has the 6-person majority, because it's not a 5-person majority that is needed, or well, it's only 5 that are needed, but there are 6 who will look to gut the Voting Rights Act even more, because the Chief Justice will be a 6th vote in this case. He is not a fan and never has been of the Voting Rights Act. Second, and probably more importantly, in Moore versus Harper, the court is going to take a swing at this theory, and I might put that in air quotes, but I will not for you. But you could think about it that way, that there's an independent state legislature concept, and that is that only state legislatures get to change the rules for elections, and even if there is a pandemic, a Secretary of State like Steve Simon or a state Supreme Court cannot change the rules to make it easier or more difficult, whichever way you might think about it, in terms of changing the voting rules. And if that happens, that will absolutely have an effect on the partisan makeup of states, state coalitions in state legislatures, as well as state coalitions in Congress. And then just 2 others that I will mention here. The court will have an impact, which could impact future elections in terms of affirmative action, the 2 cases coming out of Harvard and out of UNC Chapel Hill, and then on religious liberty, because the court is coming back to the issue of whether or not people who do not believe in same-sex marriage have to provide services to couples of the same sex who are getting married. This time it is no longer a cake maker. This time it is a web designer who would not like to perform those services for a same-sex couple. And those aren't directly related to elections, but they very well could be, in terms of the idea of putting coalitions together to get people to turn out to push back at policies that the court is handing down. And so in the end, I think that we will probably stay in this idea, even though I suggest here that the court may have had a large impact, it may have already, and my argument is that that impact has dissipated. There was the coalition building. There was we're going to get more people to register. There is more early voting, but it's dissipating by the day, by the hour, by the minute. But the court is going to very clearly have a major impact on future elections. And that last point, the 3rd point here, is one that you should continue to think about. And I say to my students, and I will end on this note, for why the court will have an effect on future elections. Those of you who are students here, who are around 20 years old, when you are a decade older than I am, when you get to that age, meaning you'll be 60 or 61, there are probably a minimum of 3 justices that will still be on the United States Supreme Court. And that means they will have an effect for 4 decades of your life, right? I'm 51, and there are justices still sitting on the bench who were just on the bench when I was your age in college. And so that's going to have a major effect not only on policy in general, but on elections for years and decades to come. Thank you all very much.
What do I do? Just this? Down.
Just keep clicking down, baby. Like 1 more time.
One more time. There. Oh,
There you go.
I escaped. Now I gotta go back what? I gotta. Just hit presentation. Yeah, where is that? I forget in here. Oh, this one. Where'd it go? Do not have a cursor. The cursor has disappeared.
This final one.
There's no cursor. There it is. Phew. Minor technical delay. Thanks everybody for showing up for the last presentation. I'm gonna take an even broader view. I'm gonna go outside the United States, and I also only have 1 slide, so that's it. And the point that I'm going to start off with is to take a global perspective on the future of democracy. And the key on this slide is actually the blue dotted line, is countries that are democracies. that are, what the authors who created this particular slide, these political scientists based in Sweden, they actually, so they have this measurement of democracy, and they're looking at whether countries are moving more towards better democracy or more democracy, or whether they're moving towards autocracy. So they called it autocratization phase. And so what you see is not only is the number of countries that are undergoing a democratization episode, moving towards democracy, not only has that declined over the last few years, the number of democracies that are themselves experiencing a decline in the quality of democracy has declined. So this is the global perspective, and there are some well-known cases of what's called democratic backsliding, Hungary or Brazil or Poland, the Philippines. And so given these examples and what you see on the slide, the global picture is somewhat concerning. And what I want to add to this, of course, is that the observers also put the United States in one of these cases of countries that is autocratizing because of polarization, because of the threats to the validity of elections and voting rights, et cetera, et cetera. There's certainly a heightened sense that it's not just in the United States where we're concerned about polarization, but in many countries around the world, not just concerned about polarization, but about the very health of democracy. And this raises the question, why? Why does there seem to be something in the water around the world? And the question turns to really, why do politicians themselves have incentives to undermine what are called the guardrails of democracy in so many countries? And why do voters in many of these countries enthusiastically support such moves, apparently willing to sacrifice the rules of democracy to keep their chosen leader in office? Now, scholars have been, cracking their heads trying to answer this question. It's a big question. There's patterns around the world. We want to explain these patterns. And one of the answers focuses on the impact of economic change in recent decades in various countries. It's big words we can mention, deindustrialization or globalization, which have contributed to declining perceptions of economic mobility. This should be a familiar theme in American politics as well. Middle-class Americans increasingly worry that the American dream is dead and that there's just not going to be great opportunities for them in the future or for their children. Now, another answer, I should say, well, that's probably partly true. That's contributing to it. But another answer draws attention to the effect of cultural change, triggered by immigration or terrorist threats or changing gender roles. Again, not just in the US, but in many countries around the world. But just in the US, it's a very different country than it was just 50 years ago. And some of these changes in our culture encourage some voters to see the world increasingly in terms of us versus them. And of course, politicians, well, they always see benefit to exploiting such fears. People are uncertain about the way the world is moving. But there's a third answer for why democracy is under threat around the world. And this turns our attention to the impact of international forces on domestic politics. This is what I want to emphasize for the rest of my time. In terms of international threat, first, one thing we know is that Russia and China have been seeking to undermine democracies. Now, both of these countries have strategic interests in weakening the U.S. and in weakening the so-called liberal international order that the U.S. established and has led since the end of World War II. Now, this system includes the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and many other international organizations. And it's based on the sovereignty of each member of the United Nations. But there's a deep tension between this principle of sovereignty and the UN's goals of supposedly enforcing supposedly universal human rights. Now, in the latter years of the Cold War, in the 70s and 80s, the United States tied economic and military aid to the protection of such rights and the establishment of democracy. China and Russia, well, they think that this system favors the U.S. too much and is unfair to their interests. Now, they enjoy calling out the United States whenever our foreign policy is hypocritical, when we support a dictator or we ignore human rights violations. But more importantly, China and Russia question the entire idea that there are universal human rights, and they seek to undermine U.S. leadership and influence. But there's another side to this story of international forces at work that's, I think, equally, if not more important about the reason why democracy appears to be under threat around the world. It's not just because of Russia and China. We also have to look at the relative importance of democracy promotion for the key democracies and pro-democratic actors in the world system. Now, when democracy was spreading, like on my chart here, from the 1970s through the 1990s, spreading around the world, key global powers, including the United States, but also the European Union and the Vatican, all actively promoted democracy. And this made a big difference, as the lines on the map, on the chart show. But today, these actors no longer stand up for democracy to the same degree. Now, during the Cold War, all of these global actors supported democracy, but partly because they were fighting communism. And that was, after all, the whole point of the Cold War, right? From our side, at least, given we defeated fascism in World War II. But communism died in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And what does this mean? It means we don't have an enemy anymore whose ideology poses what many people believe to be an existential threat to the American way of life. And this means our government has weaker motivation to support democracy in foreign policy. It was a lot easier to set democracy against communism, set these two ideologies against each other. But today, it's harder to put competition with Russia and China in terms of promoting democracy and an existential threat. And then we also have to factor in the importance of 9/11. The war on terror has just put democracy promotion on the foreign policy back burner for the United States. Now, fighting communism and promoting democracy were, at least in principle, compatible. But fighting terrorism and promoting democracy are not. In the search for allies against terrorist threats, the United States has been willing to set aside demands to protect human rights and safeguard political freedoms. No matter what China and Russia do, the US just isn't that interested as it once was in promoting democracy. Well, let me turn to the European Union now for a minute. In the 70s and 80s, up through the 90s, it drew in smaller southern and Eastern European non-democratic countries, kind of like a magnet. Well, these countries knew that membership in the EU meant jobs, it meant trade, it meant economic growth. And to join, all of these countries had to become democracies. But today, some of the clearest cases of backsliding come from within the European Union, Hungary and Poland most notably. Now, it seems kind of paradoxical. They were required to become democracies, but now they're backsliding away from democracy. But this tells us that this requirement to join the EU to be a democracy was all bark and no bite. The problem is the EU has no way to enforce its own principles. Now, many observers believe that no country would ever leave the European Union after they joined, because it's very costly to do so. But then we have Brexit, and it just showed that that's wrong. So what we're seeing is an increase in nationalist fervor around Europe. And when this happens, what voters are signaling that they just don't care about EU membership. They care more about feeling that their country is sovereign and independent. And the EU has been both unwilling and unable to sanction backsliding within its member governments because it's afraid the whole project is going to come crashing down. So that's strike two. It's another important global actor that's no longer standing up for democracy as it once did. So finally, what about the Vatican? The first thing to remember about the Vatican is that it was only in the 1960s that the church started being okay with democracy. For centuries before that, the church opposed democracy, and I mean really opposed democracy as a danger to the faith. And it wasn't until the Second Vatican Council meeting in the 1960s that the church began to publicly align its own teachings with support for freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, and democratic principles more generally. Well, why did it change its tune? The answer is, again, communism. Fascist regimes, well, like Nazi Germany, they exalted the state over individuals, and so did communist systems. Now, with fascist regimes defeated in 1945, democracy became a tactical ally in the fight against a more dangerous threat, communism. And the election of a Polish Pope, John Paul II, in 1978 was no accident. He tirelessly promoted democratic principles worldwide, and not just in the so-called captive nations of communist Eastern Europe, like his homeland. But as with the United States, communism's defeat meant the church had lost its main nemesis. So in recent years, we've seen the re-emergence of its centuries-long ambivalence with liberalism, individualism, and modernity itself. The clearest evidence for this comes in the church's active and globally organized effort to combat what it calls gender ideology, a pejorative term for progressive policies surrounding gender, sexuality, and reproductive freedom. This has aligned the church with far-right movements and backsliding governments in Eastern Europe and beyond. So to close, I'm not suggesting that the church, the US, or the European Union are actively promoting non-democracy around the world, but what I am suggesting is that Russian and Chinese meddling is only one side of the coin. in terms of understanding democracy's future. The flip side is that the fact that key pro-democratic actors on the world stage, including the United States, the EU, and the Vatican, well, they have different interests and incentives today than what they did 25 or 50 years ago. And such interests no longer clearly line up with the promotion and protection of democracy. So for this reason, I'm sorry to end on this note, but there's some degree of warranted pessimism. Thanks.
Thank you, David, for that very depressing talk. No, thanks to all 5 of you for a very engaging set of presentations. It's now my great pleasure to turn things over to Dean John Coleman, who has been studying those index cards very carefully and now will moderate our Q&A session.
Thank you, Professor Karch. Thank all of you for being here in the room and online, and thanks to all of our panelists for really excellent and extremely interesting presentations. We have received some questions in the room here, so I'm going to group a few of these, and there's some we'll take individually as well, but there were several questions kind of in and around the area of partisanship, and it probably won't surprise you, and this picks up a little with our last comment from our last speaker, but people are a little depressed about partisanship in the comments we've received here. And so here are the questions that were posed, and I'm going to invite anyone on the panel who wants to weigh in on any one or all of these to add some comments. The first, are there ways to counter the power of partisanship? And I'm taking that as the pull of partisanship on voter loyalties. How might ranked choice voting disrupt some of the partisanship we're seeing at the polls? And then lastly, the question here, and I'm going to add a little bit to it, the question is about what might we look at to try to understand partisan difference within a particular group. So you take a group of white voters, Protestant voters, whatever it might be, and there may be a lean in that group, but there's differentiation in the group as well. But let me just specify that a little bit more. One of the things we've been hearing a lot about in recent election cycles is the importance of education and education level in separating voters more than had been the case in the past. So I'll just ask whether education has become in some ways the primary, or at least one of the top primary divisions between voters on the left and on the right, Republican and Democrat. So ranked choice voting, the education factor among voters, including within groups, and then if there's any other magic solution you may want to offer for the challenges of partisanship. We are all ready to hear. So, anyone who wants to, well, no one wants to volunteer, so I'll just pick on someone. Professor Myers, how would you like to start?
I actually do have a magic solution, John, and I've just been waiting for someone to ask me for it. Yeah, so it's difficult for a couple of reasons. One way to understand the increase in partisanship in society is that people's other social identities have tended to become, and to the extent that people think about politics and have issue positions, they've tend to become sorted. So they're much more aligned with the party. We have many fewer people who have what we refer to as cross-cutting identities. So some identities that pull them in a Republican direction, some identities that pull them in a Democratic direction, and similarly with issues. That's not to say that they don't exist, and that gets to some of the partisan differences within a group, but there's fewer of those identities than there used to be. So breaking down the sort of kind of partisanship that we see now, this big picture solution has got to involve something about de-aligning, creating, well, not creating, but sort of the emergence of new cleavages in the electorate that sort of pull apart some of those groupings. of a bunch of identities in one Republican corner and a bunch of identities in another. I think some of that has to do with an older theme in social science, but just the decline of social capital in general. People belong to a lot fewer community groups than they used to. They spend more time online. Before online, they spent more time watching TV. And this has created a less dense network of social ties that might give you those countervailing pulls and pushes so that you could see things from either side. Because you had some social ties that were pulling you in one direction, some social ties that were pulling you in another. So with that said, I think, I'm in favor of ranked choice voting. I think it's probably a good thing. I don't think that kind of institutional, there is not in fact one weird trick to solve polarization. And so I don't, I think ranked choice voting could potentially allow some stronger minor parties or more competition within parties that might do some of this pulling apart. But short of switching to a sort of full proportional representational system, I don't think there's really an institutional fix to this. And as David can attest, this is something that's happening around the world, including in places where there are different electoral systems.
I can jump in addition to this, I want to distinguish between negative partisanship and partisanship more generally. In addition to the rise of partisan polarization, we've also seen a rise in negative partisanship, which is having stronger feelings of negative affect toward the other party than attachment to your own party. In other words, voting against the other party rather than voting for your party. And sort of we see this in surveys. We see this in the high percentages of voters who vote for the candidates of their own party, but yet don't offer them very high approval ratings. And then, of course, we see this in partisan conflict, both among the mass public and in legislatures. But I also think it's important to sort of, recognize that political scientists also see a lot of values in parties. Parties promote responsiveness in a way that sort of other coalitions might not in government. And in fact, in the 1950s, political scientists wrote a report asking parties in Congress to be more responsive and to actually be more cohesive and essentially pass civil rights legislation and other important legislation. Now, political scientists today agree that parties went way overboard, but there is something useful about partisanship as a heuristic, as something that sort of organizes and manages conflict and gets some responsiveness, but it's that conflict and negative partisanship that has just gone too far and prevented compromise and prevented two parties from working through issue differences and passing legislation to respond to big problems. That's sort of where we are, but parties aren't inherently evil. It's sort of where we are today in our contemporary politics.
And I want to, jump in just a few seconds. So with partisanship, I guess there's some new research. I wouldn't say it's new. That people are actually kind of moving away in terms of partisan identifiers. People that used to identify with the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, when you start looking at surveys, people are placing themselves in the independent category. And a lot of that may be because of the fighting that they're seeing, and people don't necessarily want to identify with one of the parties. But what many researchers are saying, that this is problematic in a lot of ways, because what you have is independents aren't truly independents. They're usually leaning toward one party or the other, and so they're kind of disengaging, and the people that are kind of left over, the people who are the intense partisans, really kind of driving the agenda. So you don't get that form of moderation you might need in terms of deliberations on important hot button issues. Ranked choice voting as a way, I think in a lot of ways ranked choice voting can provide an opportunity for less, divisive. The goal in a political campaign is you want to, everyone starts off with all the positive advertising, but then they start attacking one another. And so with ranked choice voting, you have to be real careful about how you attack your opponents, because you may need those people to rank you higher up. So I think it might change the tenor of how the campaign is going, but in terms of actual polarization itself, that's a question that's still being researched and up to debate.
So I'm going to jump in here, and you may be surprised, and I think I'm surprised myself why I'm going to talk about partisanship when I'm a Supreme Court expert. But in fact, it turns out that partisanship has had a pretty deleterious effect on the federal judicial system. And that is, we know statistically that up until about the last 6 to 8 years, senators in particular voted based on their ideological predilections, and presidents were picking judicial nominees based on their ideological predilections. And it has almost turned completely now over the past several years to those decisions being made based on partisanship. Now, you might ask yourself, what's the difference between ideology and partisanship? And I can put it down to 2 examples. Actually, well, 3. 2 of them are together. And the first 2 are former Justices Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Stephen Breyer. They were put on the court by not a liberal president, by a left-leaning Democratic president, Bill Clinton. And neither Ginsburg nor Breyer were liberal justices. They were left-leaning, moderate justices, depending on the issue in which they decided. But when Clinton decided to pick both of them, one in 93 and one in 94, he called the Senate Judiciary Chair into the Oval Office, Orrin Hatch, and said, here's my short list, who can you live with? And Orrin Hatch says, we can live with Ginsburg in 93, and in 94 we can live with Breyer. And now you jump to Mitch McConnell running the Senate during the Obama years, and McConnell not only made it his mission in life to beat everything, stop every policy that Obama wanted to have passed, but he made it his absolute #1 mission in order to win the partisan battle, not the ideological battle, the partisan battle to stop all of Obama's judicial nominees. And he did it incredibly effectively, and I'll tell you this, that if in fact the Republicans win the Senate, whether or not McConnell becomes the majority leader again, all Biden nominees to the federal bench are probably going to stop for 2 years. He will continue to nominate, none will probably even get committee hearings. And that's all due to partisanship, not ideology.
I want to pick up on that last comment because we have a question about polarization as it relates to the upcoming court decision that you talked about the independent state legislature theory. And the question is what you would forecast in terms of whether the outcome of that decision will itself be very polarizing and reinforce some of these divisions. Is it a theory that is falling right now on partisan lines? Is it too unknown by the average voter to have any idea what this is talking about? Just, is this one going to feed into that polarization that we see in perceptions of the court?
Yeah, so I don't actually think, and I actually imagine that Dan and Michael and Kathryn will have something to say about this. I don't think that the average citizen, and in fact, I would consider all of us, including the political scientists up here, including Dean Coleman, would think about it this way. We're not going to think about the independent state legislator theory on a daily basis. It's not going to affect our lives on a daily basis. But where it will affect our lives on a daily basis is if we have another pandemic, if we have another major emergency where right around the election we need to have very instantaneous change to voting procedure. The reason that Governor Walz did what he did, the reason, just to keep it in Minnesota, the reason Steve Simon did what he did as Secretary of State was that we needed to move quickly to make sure that people could vote and vote safely during the 2020 election. And we all know, and I know that in particular Michael and Kathryn can speak to this, legislatures don't move quickly. They may move as slowly as our judicial system. And you're not getting in Minnesota 201 senators and representatives to figure out how in God's name to change procedures to make everybody be able to vote efficiently and effectively and safely during that election process. And so I think the problem is going to be if the court would vote in the way that I suspect they will, and that is to uphold this particular theory because we have enough justices who only decide based on the plain meaning of the words of the Constitution, that in fact, that will make it very difficult to change procedures. And I think, although I don't know the data on this, these three would know it better, that it probably would favor Republican candidates much more policy-wise or election-wise than it would Democratic candidates. And that will change from state to state. But I think that the advantage is probably for the Republicans at this point.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think, you know, the average person is not going to know what the independent state legislature theory is, but what they will notice, I think people do develop a sort of general sense that the court is acting in a partisan way, and that's got a negative valence. People don't like that, and so I think that will probably be another chink in the armor of judicial legitimacy in the U.S. I do think, but the other time that people notice is if we actually get to a situation, and this is, I think Tim might have said something about this, but this is the theory that basically state legislators can decide everything about how elections are run and can't be overruled by state courts, that just in this area only state legislatures have power. And if we get a situation where a state legislature, for example, sends a different slate of of electors to Washington than won the popular vote in the state, then people are going to notice. But I think that may express itself as just more disillusionment with democracy rather than a sort of partisan backlash against the court.
Great, thank you. Continuing the polarization theme, we have a question about interest groups, and I will direct this to Professor Minta. The question is, with the increased polarization in Congress and among voters as well, what do you see, what have we seen as changes in interest groups' strategies about being involved in elections, given that they're dealing with a much more polarized Congress or legislature in the states?
Well, I mean, interest groups, I don't know if it changes their strategies too much because they're fairly narrow in interest. I mean, obviously there are some broader interest groups, some of the racial and ethnic interest groups that are have broader interests, but for the most part, they're pretty narrow. And so I don't know if polarization affects their advocacy as much. I mean, they usually target their allies, they lobby their allies, they give money to their allies, they provide information to their allies. It's very rare that interest groups try to give money and lobby the moderates or the so-called swing legislators. It's just not worth their time and effort. So I think in terms of interest group advocacy and strategy, they're going to continue, even in a polarized legislature, to really mobilize their advocates. Yeah, so I don't think it changes much.
Yep.
Thinking about interest group activity to influence elections, not so much the inside Congress strategy to lobby for bill passage, but certainly since Supreme Court decisions in 2010, we've seen Citizens United and others, we've seen just the rise of outside spending from groups aligned with one party or the other. And so, you know, candidates today, if they can't raise enough money and they're in a competitive race, they really don't need to worry because outside groups aligned with one party or the other will just put in millions of dollars into a particular race. And we're seeing that in Minnesota with outside spending on both sides. One thing that people sort of often, or my students often think is, oh, you know, Republicans must have an edge. But that's actually really not the case. I mean, it varies, but Democrats have a lot of rich donors as well. And so both parties spend just millions of dollars in outside spending that can't be coordinated with the candidate, and that outside spending is just increasing in every election. You know, and some of it is from interest groups, some of it is from C4 organizations, which are dark money, which is different because the donors aren't disclosed, but that type of activity is on the rise and very influential.
Thank you.
One of the underappreciated effects.
Yep, go ahead, please. Sorry.
One of the underappreciated effects of education polarization and Democrats getting sort of the college educated is that that's moved a lot of richer people and people who give money on politics into the Democratic coalition from the Republican coalition. So that has had an effect on fundraising too.
We have a question about, several of you noted the increasing nationalization of elections in the U.S. And so we have a two-part question. One is that something that we are seeing pretty much across all of the country, or is that only a swing state kind of issue, competitive state issue? And then secondly, whether we're seeing or have seen the same trends in global elections and politics as well. So let's take the last part of it. We'll ask Professor Samuels to comment on that.
I don't think nationalization is what I would characterize, how I would characterize polarization in other countries that I can think of. What's happening though is a transformation in party systems. For the 4 or 5 decades after the Second World War, there was a Christian Democratic Party and a Social Democratic Party, something like that, in most of the world's democracies. And that system is just gone in most of the country. I mean, France doesn't really have parties anymore. Italy has seen they just elected a far-right prime minister for the first time since Mussolini. You still see some countries that have the same parties that they've always had, like the UK, but the story in the UK is similar in the sense that the Tories, the Conservative Party, has had to save their own skin. They've had to shift really far to the right to undermine the Brexit end. It was the United Kingdom Independence Party. They got 20% of the vote in one of the elections, and that party has disappeared because the Tories ate their lunch. And that's what you've seen in a lot of countries is either the emergence of a far-right party, what I would call or it's called a right-wing populist party. Far-right has, decidedly negative connotations. The absolute collapse of the left in most countries, or as in France, for example, socialist parties just doesn't really exist anymore. It exists, it's just tiny. And so the left in many countries has had to try to reconfigure its own vote base because they're facing some of the same issues that we face here in the United States, questions of immigration, questions of industrial transformation, and the vote base is just as we've seen from my colleagues who teach American politics. The shifting demographics and shifting vote, the basis of the coalitions of these parties. And this caused a lot of unrest, or not unrest, but uncertainty in terms of what party really supports what, and do they support democracy, and how far can the left really shift towards the middle without kind of selling its own soul out. And so there's a lot of uncertainty in these emerging party coalitions in many of the world's democracies.
Thinking about the nationalization of elections, it was a long time ago that former Speaker Tip O'Neill said all politics is local, and it's really not anymore when it comes to elections at the federal level and at the state level. So if you think about the 2010 midterm elections, Obama's first midterm, Democrats lost control of the House and lost 64 seats in the House. At the same time, several Democratic governors lost, several Democratic legislatures across the country switched to Republican, and so if you look at the trends, they tend to follow in every state. And then if you look at nationwide exit polls or representative surveys with a representative sample of voters, you see this party loyalty in voting where someone is voting for the same party up and down the ballot. And it's funny, actually, reporters in Minnesota and knowledgeable people about politics in Minnesota like to say that Minnesota is actually one of the few states that splits their tickets. And every time they say this, I'm like, no, Minnesotans really don't split their tickets. Most Minnesotans vote party lines. It's just, those few instances where elections are really, really close and a few voters split their tickets that we wind up with Republicans with a one-seat majority in the Minnesota State Senate and a narrow majority for Democrats in the State House, and that also has to do with the efficiency of seats. And so most voters in most states don't split their tickets because that partisanship that Professor Myers talked about is really, really driving vote choice. Now, a really good candidate or a really bad candidate can cause someone to defect from their partisan identification, but for the most part, this is a nationwide trend that we're seeing.
And I think also partly, I mean, you only have about 35 to 40 seats nationally for the U.S. House that you're really competing for, that the Republicans and Democrats are competing for control of the majority. And then the same thing when in the Senate, there are a few seats that can make the difference. And so now with the influx of money that you can have, I mean, these, even though you're in Minnesota, you might be very concerned about, you know, what's going on in Nevada or what's going on in Georgia, because it could make a difference in whether which party controls the Senate or controls the House. I know some of my students were saying, I don't like the fact that people are bringing money into Minnesota and influencing our elections, but you know, Angie Craig's seat is a seat that could determine who controls the U.S. House of Representatives. And so I don't think that's going to change anytime soon.
Yeah, I think nationalization, I forget the commentator, but there was a political commentator who wrote a piece about nationalization, and he said that he knew that we were in trouble as a nation when he went to an event for Republicans running, I think it was for Iowa Secretary of Agriculture. I'm not 100% sure if that's right or if that is actually a race. But for an agriculture secretary in some state, and every candidate got up and introduced themselves by saying that they were very strong believers in the sanctity of life, is their opening pitch for being elected to be the head of agriculture in the state. And so this is something we've seen nationwide. The one thing I'd add is I think a lot of this we can tie to the change in media systems. We don't get our news, most of us, from local news anymore. Just do a poll here in the audience. How many people have a subscription to the Star Tribune or the Pioneer Press? Okay. How many people have a subscription to the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times? Okay, yeah, so that's the problem right there in a nutshell. And for those online, there was about twice as many hands for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal than for the Star Tribune and the Pioneer Press. If all the news you get is national, you don't get the information you need to differentiate between what's a Minnesota Democrat and what's a national Democrat. And so you vote straight party ticket.
Thank you. One more question, is it okay? We have a question tying together a few things from the presentation. So we have this pattern of midterm elections, meaning losses for the Democratic Party. We have nationalization of elections. But at the same time, we saw a slide up there with the wizards at 538, still giving Democrats a higher likelihood of holding on to the Senate, which is 50-50 right now, of holding on to that than losing it. How do we tie those three things together?
So one issue, of course, is that only a third of all Senate seats are up, and so it really so it's really heavily influenced by which Senate seats are competitive. Now, as I said, about an equal number of democratically held and Republican-held seats are competitive, but the Senate is just candidates are able to individualize themselves to a greater extent in Senate races than they are in House races. There's more media attention, they tend to face stronger challengers, and in this particular cycle, Republicans are disadvantaged in a few key races by the candidate that they chose in party primaries. So it is definitely the case that Ohio should not be close, but it is, because of Trump-endorsed candidate J.D. Vance. Ohio could have nominated someone who would have been a more competitive candidate. We see a similar dynamic in Pennsylvania. We see a similar dynamic with Herschel Walker in Georgia. And so some states are competitive for Democrats, where if Republicans had chose a different candidate, they would not necessarily be competitive. I should add that the Senate map 2 years from now is not a good map for Democrats. But the context for the Senate, you've got to incorporate the map in which seats are up.
And John, I wanted to say something. I'm surprised we didn't get many questions on this in David's presentation about Democratic backsliding. The one thing that I want to say, and just want to get it off my chest, I'm really concerned about the number of candidates that are running that are election deniers. So whether you're a Democrat, Republican, legalized marijuana party, usually in our system, if you lose an election, you usually say, okay, didn't like that loss, but we'll run again. And so I think this attack, I think the win at all costs type of attitude is really undermining are, and even though we keep saying, oh, it's not going to be a big deal, but we got some candidates, or Secretary of State, auditors that are claiming that they may not accept the results of an election. So, I mean, this is a very problematic, and this is troubling times, and I think these are things that we really have to pay attention to. Again, regardless if you're a Democrat, Republican, we're in some really tenuous times.
Very good. Thank you. I want to thank the audience for the excellent set of questions, and thank you to our panelists for the answers. Thanks so much.
And to continue with that theme, I want to thank Dean Coleman for so capably moderating our Q&A. I also want to acknowledge that events like this don't happen without outstanding staff, and so I want to extend a special thanks to Alexis Cuttons, Corey Dawson, Caitlin Boley, Josie Kellenbeck, and Dax Schwartz from Political Science, who have made this all possible. I'd also like to thank the staff here at the McNamara Alumni Center for giving us this space and making things work for us. Finally, last but certainly not least, a huge thank you to our audience for an outstanding set of questions. Thank you for joining us tonight and asking some really thoughtful queries of our panelists who have done an outstanding job, as they always do. And so with that, good night, everyone, and thank you once again for joining us.